I'm going to let you know right now, this video has a plot twist in the middle. But first I have to start with the game. Dungeon Kid is an amazingly bland RPG. It's a first-person dungeon crawler in the style of Wizardry, where there's one town and one dungeon, and your goal is to find and defeat the boss of the dungeon. When you start the game, you build a party of 3 characters. One is designated the hero, and there's 2 assistants, but that role doesn't matter at all. There are 12 separate classes that you can assign to each character, and the primary difference between all of them is what styles of magic are available to them. They also differ in base stats and how they grow, but the magic is really the significant difference. After you've picked out your characters, you go to town, where there's an inn to recover health, a shop to buy equipment and supplies, a temple to heal status effects, and that's it, nothing else. The other options are to enter the dungeon or to save the game. The game lets you do a battery save to the cartridge, or save to ASCII's TurboFile peripheral. The TurboFile was essentially a saving device that plugged into the Famicom's expansion port. In the dungeon, you explore it from a first-person perspective, and naturally you'll have random encounters with enemies, and here you have the standard options to fight, run away, or cast spells. There's 4 types of magic that are available. Offensive, which does damage to 1 enemy at a time. Defensive, which boosts the defense of 1 character in the party. Healing, which is exactly what you'd expect. And the rather broad Other, which are status effects and other stat buffs. Also, Raise Dead for some reason. The dungeon in Dungeon Kid is tiny. It consists of 5 floors, and each floor is 32 by 32. So it's only going to take you a few hours to beat the game. Well, except for the fact that the random encounters tend to be very unfair. If your party isn't built for survival, you can easily get wiped out in 1 or 2 attacks. On top of that, the equipment that you can get is very limited in scope. The dungeons don't have any kind of special features like secret doors, or traps that do anything other than inflict status ailments or damage on you. Dungeon Kid is strictly a maze crawler, and frankly, it's not a very good one. It's shallow even by 8-bit RPG standards, and this game is not going to hold anybody's attention. Well, at least until they hit down on the start menu and go into edit mode. Because Dungeon Kid is not just a very bare-bones, simple RPG, it's a toolkit to make your own RPGs. Now, this wasn't the first time that somebody offered this kind of software, not by a long shot. In fact, the series that would eventually spawn the RPG Maker series had a release just 6 months before this, though the first console release for RPG Sukuru is still several years away. So Dungeon Kid is the first time that anybody has done anything like this on a console. There's no programming or scripting here, and you can't edit any of the graphics. But everything else? Well, the users are free to change all of it. All of the message text, all of the monster stats, all of the items, all of the spell abilities. Now that said, a lot of it is heavily restricted. You can't really add anything, you can just edit what's already there. And you're severely limited on quantity of things that you can place in your dungeon. There is one significant thing that you can change. You can decide if you want to have the fantasy setting or a sci-fi setting. It's basically 2 completely different graphics sets that can be applied. The dungeon that you can create is up to 8 floors, and in the editor, B erases whatever you're on, while A places your item. You can place as many walls and doors as you like, though doors have to have an open space on both sides. But everything else is very restricted in how many you can place down, even locked doors. Most special features are limited to just 5 throughout the whole dungeon. For things like magic spells and items, you can affect the strength of the effect, but not what the effect is. And for monsters, you can determine where they'll appear, and adjust all of their stats. And of course you can save your creations to the TurboFile, and take them over to your friend's house to challenge them to your dungeon. The single biggest problem with Dungeon Kid is that it's really hard to edit anything. The map editor is probably the best of them, but the interface isn't as smooth as you'd like. You have to click on the map in the upper right to move between sections that you're editing, and you have to select an icon and then hit A twice to switch to placing that. The interface is much worse at editing text, where you have to scroll through every single character to do any inputs. I got frustrated doing that just entering a character's name. I couldn't imagine editing the opening and closing text like this. Still, Dungeon Kid is an impressive tool for anyone who wanted to play around with making their own dungeon. And it seemed to have gained a bit of a following in Japan in 1990 for that. Unfortunately, if you do manage to make an RPG in Dungeon Kid, you still have to play in the Dungeon Kid system. And there's only so much you can do with that. This is a strong set of tools attached to an RPG system that is not that great. But maybe you can mitigate things by reducing the power of the enemies a bit and changing around player equipment.